Welcome back to A Celtic State of Mind. I'm Paul John Dykes, and this week I'm delighted to be joined by Quinny, Asim and Tino. Gentlemen, welcome back to A Celtic State of Mind. You have all appeared at various different times, but it's a good time, I think, for a proper discussion about where Celtic are as we sit here heading for another treble, where we're going, and what kind of things might be obstacles in the path. I'm obviously Paul John Dykes from the Celtic State of Mind. I'm joined, and I'm delighted to be joined by Quinny from Celtic here, Asim, who has appeared on your podcast, The Celtic State of Mind, and others, and of course Tino from the Celtic Exchange. So really just to have a right good chat about where we are. I'm going to start with you, Quinny. This season, I've been hearing it's a boring, tedious treble. Is there such a thing?
I don't think so, no. I think, you know, a lot of that chat comes from the other side, doesn't it? Or comes from the angry neutrals that kind of hover around the Scottish game in general. I think obviously we want the treble to go on and get completed. It's still kind of early days yet, but it's certainly not been boring. Far from it, I would say.
You know, there is jealousy, isn't it? Envy. You know, when you see something that is good and you're in the same game, why not try and aspire to reach that level, Asim? Is it a cultural thing? Is it part of society where people just want to drag you down rather than say, what a success that is?
Yeah, like Scottish football, it's got so much going for it. You know, people talk about it's got the biggest attendances per capita, you know, in Europe. So, and rather than look at the positives, I feel like those in Scotland that run the game, those that are in charge of other clubs, always try and find ways to bring it down or to look at the negatives. It was interesting, coming out of the game on Sunday there at the Scottish Cup semi-final against St Johnstone. St Johnstone fans were coming over and saying, brilliant team, brilliant performance. So rare to see, you know, like you said, they're looking at others and looking at the successes of the likes of Celtic. But you see so many commentators, media, mainstream media talking about, yeah, it's too easy. Why even celebrating? Stuff like that. It just doesn't make sense. You know, your question to Quinny, has it been the most scintillating of seasons from a Celtic point of view? At points, yes. You know, you look at the first half of the season, you know, performances have dropped off in the second half. But of course, it's, you know, you cannot take these things for granted. It's not easy to win trebles. I've seen your stat, Paul John. You can go into the maths if you want about the probabilities of Celtic winning all those trebles. It's unheard of. You know, even in other leagues where they've got a dominant force, it's not the done thing. And I don't think that should ever be, you know, taken for granted or underappreciated.
I think the headline, I'm sure you're referring to it just now, is this the most tedious treble of all time? And it's an oxymoron if ever there was one. A tedious treble. Winning 3 trophies is not easy. If Celtic won this one, it's 9 and 137 years of Celtic, and that tells you that it's not an easy thing to do. And I think as Celtic fans we can rise above that and enjoy it for what it is, but there's a lot of hate out there.
Massive, Tino, and you know, we're used to it from outside of Scottish football. We're a tin pot league. Your granny would score 40, all this kind of stuff, and you take all that with a pinch of salt, because I know, Quinny, that you're a fan of other football outside of Scotland. I've lost interest in English football, for example, so they go on about being the richest league and all the rest of it. There's something about Scottish football that is missing from the English game, if you ask me. A big part of that is the fan base. But why do we then decry our own game the way that I've been seeing over the last few days?
I think, like, I heard it on ACSOM over the last week. I was away from my holidays myself, so I've been kind of catching up or whatever. But I think it's a little bit of, like, Scotland, just a little bit of Scottish society, a little bit, because it is quite a, like, football all across the world, for all the biggest clubs, if you look at their history, their background, how they were formed, there is like that tribalistic element of it. You can even look at like Barcelona, Real Madrid, your Rivers, your Bocas. There's always like a genesis somewhere in like society where there's like, you know, this club formed for this reason and this club formed for that reason. And for Celtic and Rangers, it's very much magnified, isn't it? But it's not. The difference here, for me anyway, is kind of everyone all across Scotland has a side to lean on, even if they are an Aberdeen fan, a Hibs fan, or whatever, you know. So it feels like it's just more kind of ingrained. When you look across the rest of Europe, just to kind of keep it a bit closer to home, I think one thing Scottish football does miss a trick with in this kind of vein is like being itself, like accepting that it's like a wee bit old-fashioned, a wee bit old school. The refs are crap, the tackles are hard, you know what I mean, and that sort of thing. And rather than pointing the finger of blame or, you know, whatever the team that's winning, there's not that willingness to club together and like, this is, you know, we're in this together, we're the same league, let's shake this tin pot like attitude or perception other people have, and how do we enhance, how do we make it Scottish, how do we make it our league and make it better? We don't need to be like England and do all this stuff, and we don't need to be like Germany and do this or Italy. But what makes Scottish football, and then how do you tap in and enhance that? And that's all about buy-in from everyone. And that, again, the sad thing is you very rarely get buy-in from everyone because everyone's protecting their own corner, and I don't want to tell you my secrets, and I don't want to do anything that will help your club, and it might not help mine, and it's all that kind of stuff for me.
We spoke, I think just last week on our show, about the fact that Scottish football still at this moment in time has a bit of soul. There's still something there.
Totally.
And there's stories to be told, and I think there's a responsibility. We obviously come at it from a fan media angle, but mainstream absolutely have a part to play. And I mentioned that article, TD's treble. I think it was Scottish Daily Mail, just to call it out. I believe that these guys have a duty to big up the game, promote the game, whereas maybe as a Scottish thing, Quinny, they're far keener just to play it down and dilute what are actually some really good narratives and some really good stories doing the rounds.
You look at the English Premiership, that's what that's been built on since the early 90s, the whole Sky package. They really hype the game up, even when it's been garbage at times, but they'll hype up Super Sunday, Burnley versus Sheffield United, just for example. I know they're in the Championship right now, but they sell the game well. They know how to advertise it, they know how to market it. In Scotland, it's the complete opposite. You look at the whole fixtures, even just for the post-split, why not make that Celtic Rangers game the decider? It's small things like that.
Although the Pope is trying his best to make that happen, by all accounts. But getting this weekend's game cancelled. No, but you're right. Just embrace the Scottishness of the sport. But also, I think clubs need to do a lot more individually, right? Because I don't think people say, it's all about investment. I wouldn't trust all of these clubs with investment, Asim. Give them multi-millions of pounds and they'll just scoosh it.
Yeah.
I look around at the stadiums, even like on a TV spectacle, the gantries are in the wrong place. The camera angles are terrible. There's a skip in the corner of the most stadiums, and you're looking at that thinking, these are the basics.
Yeah.
The 100 different shades of red in the seats.
Yeah.
For example, these things could be fixed. They could work a lot better. So all these clubs and the fans, the top three, I don't know about you on the social media, after the weekend, the top three having a dig at Celtic are Rangers, Hearts and Aberdeen. Strangely enough, going on about how boring it is and, it must be boring to win everything. Well, I have never been bored.
I celebrated the goals on Sunday there against St Johnstone as much as any. Really enjoyable, game to watch and a game to support. And I seen someone tweeting just before we came in here who says, I'm really fed up of people telling me how I should feel when it comes to football. Some people might well be bored, that's on them, but I think you lads can tell me your own opinion. I'm really enjoying what Celtic are doing. Yes, there's been more thrilling seasons and when it's a bit more neck and neck. Celtic can't control that. Yeah. Celtic can't dictate how good Rangers, Hearts, Hibs, Aberdeen are. We can only look after ourselves, and I think we're doing a pretty good job at the moment.
It's sensational. We're an anomaly in many, many ways. Asim, we often talk on a Monday about the braindometer and where Kevin Graham's gauge is since coming back. Obviously, he left under controversial circumstances. He's come back, and I think there was a lot of Celtic fans maybe surprised, Quinny, how long it took for him to stamp his identity on the Celtic team. The first half of his first season back, having watched Angie's team and how entertaining they were, was a bit of a slog at times. But he's definitely stamped his authority now, isn't he?
Yeah, well, again, it's definitely not made it a tedious or a boring treble, has it? Because this has been like the first full season of Brendan 2.0 or the second coming or whatever we're going to think of it as. And it's the Celtic
Renaissance for calling it.
Yeah, totally. And it's much more like the Celtic way, where it's wingers, it's goals, it's exciting. And just football is obviously exciting, don't get me wrong, but it's much more kind of in line with that historical identity again that we recognise. Everyone growing up watching Celtic has got a favourite player that was probably quite fast, probably scored a couple of goals, probably played kind of out wide. If it wasn't Henrik Larsson himself, it might have been somebody like a Lubo or there's a bunch of other players out there. And this squad now, with the emergence of Kuhn in the first half of the season, and we can kind of talk about how that's kind of panned out throughout the rest of the year. Jota in the building, Dyson from wide, getting to 20 plus goals before coming in centre. Like that, it's been great to see. There was some great comments from Joe Hart post-retirement, and he said like that initial 6 months when he took over from Ange, he didn't want to really rock the boat, didn't really disturb anything too much. And for any kind of stick that Brendan does get, like the one thing that you get from him is absolute elite execution. He has like operated at the top level consistently throughout his career, in England before coming to us the first time and then going back there, winning a cup. Fair enough that, it didn't really finish out too well for them there, but when he comes back, that's where his standards are, that's where his expectations are. And yeah, it took a little bit longer than we might have thought versus the first time when he came in, when he took over from Dyla, because the Dyla squad was kind of just like a blank canvas, wasn't it? There wasn't a proper identity there. But yeah, this year it's been free flowing when it's been at its best.
Yeah, you mentioned Kuhn there, Asim, and lots of chat on ACSOM has been around his drop in form. What is it? Should we be worried? Is his head out the door?
I think the fact that Brendan took him out of the team, subbed him quite a couple of times as well at half time, to me was a bit of a concern, because that's not just someone maybe out of form. You know, there's been other players out of form, but Brendan's kind of stuck by them, which to me suggests that Brendan feels their attitude is still okay and they maybe just need to play their way back into form. With Kuhn, it did maybe seem like he just, after Bayern, just thought, right, that's his season's work done. You know, that's his shop window. He's had a great start to the season. Champions League's over, and then could just relax. And I think Brendan said some players just wanted an easy game after that McDermott Park game. I think that was in reference to the likes of Kuhn. You know, he's a guy that came off at halftime. I think Schlupp was the other. So I think it is a concern. I think good man management from Brendan, the way he's switched the team up the last couple of weeks. Guys like Forrest coming in, taking. I thought Jota coming out of the team was maybe a bit harsh. I don't think he's been one that I would have thought was guilty of not giving it, you know, his all or taking his eye off the ball. But in terms of Kuhn, yeah, and I'll be interested to see now, does Kuhn come back in the side for what could be the title clincher, and then obviously the game at Ibrox and then the final. That will be the true test. There was talk earlier in the season of some of the clubs that you could go to. I don't think that's going to be there now, because that's the kind of thing that top clubs will be looking at. How's your mentality? How's your character to do it week in, week out, not just when it's a big game. So yeah, we'll see how that goes. But just to touch on what Tino said earlier, I think the strange thing about this season is it's just been so easy so early on. You know, ever since that first Celtic Park game, pretty much you felt the league was done. And as Tino said, you can't control how poor or otherwise the opposition are going to be. But I think naturally that's just human nature. We've seen it in lots of Celtic teams gone by, that when the league's in the bag, the performances do tail off a wee bit. Like the extent of it in some of the recent weeks was maybe a concern for a lot of fans, and likewise probably the manager. But again, when the big games come along, semi-final there, you just know Rodgers is going to get them pumped up. His records in semi-finals and finals is incredible. And you wouldn't put it past us having another big scoreline.
And it's been disappointing to see that drop off, you know, certainly against Rangers a couple of times, against St Johnstone. And there's no excuse for it in the bigger picture, but it is understandable. It is human nature, and the bottom line is Celtic players and manager, they can motivate when it really counts, when it comes to the semi-finals and the finals and even the Bayern game. And I think to an extent, you know, we can be frustrated in the moment. We were, you know, frustrated at St Johnstone. But in the bigger picture, we're in a pretty strong position. I think it's credit to the guys like Kuhn and others who have maybe dropped off a bit that have put us in this position.
I think the key is then, if you're looking at some of the big buzzwords that Brendan's been using, talking about mentality, ambition in the game, talking about ambition in the game, to have the backups that you've been able to bring in and then drop the guys that have maybe been off it. I think Schlupp got this fright of his life coming to Celtic, because although he's had a decent career, has he ever played with a club where the demands are so high? You know, he probably hasn't, Quinny.
Oh, see, with that thing, I always remember quotes from Strachan. I forget precisely when it was, but you know, it was around the fact of, like, prior to being Celtic manager, he'd been Southampton and Coventry manager, and like getting out of that mentality of not losing games is totally different to you cannot not win, you know. And another thing I would bring into that as well, in terms of adapting to the Celtic mentality, the expectations of the club, the fans and everything. Brendan's made some comments in the last week or two, and I'm, you know, like, there's some speculation around Kuhn's future and all the rest of it, so maybe that does come into it. Maybe he's a wee bit different in this case, but I do think as fans we maybe need to give a wee bit of latitude to like Kuhn and Engels and a few of these guys. So like Rodgers was highlighting, like, they have never played as many games in a season as they have this year. Never mind all the pressure and the expectation of everything, you know. So if it is innocent and he isn't like harping for a move away or whatever, like, you know, we've seen Celtic players before. Like, I know this is his second season technically, because we signed him like January last year or whatever, but it could be like a breakout kind of thing for him when he comes back again, even bigger and stronger, you would hope. But that is the main difference of somebody who can play here and who can't.
I also think winger's such a unique position. It's a pressure position, and I think you're either bang on it or not. There doesn't seem to be a middle ground. I was a huge fan of Mikey Johnston. I thought there was a real talent there. I believe there still is a real talent there. But his Celtic talent's not enough. You need to have that mentality, that headspace. And I think that's where Mikey fell a wee bit short. And just on that, actually, he's at a West Brom who are mid-table. David Turnbull's potentially going to get relegated with Cardiff City. Rocco Quinn's at Watford, Daniel Kelly at Millwall. Draws and defeats are par for the course for these sides. It's a completely different world from Celtic. And I think when you've got, whether it was Mikey in the wing, Kuhn at the moment's been talked about. I'm a big Yang fan, that's my thing. I'll die on that hill. But there's so much pressure because the moment a winger gets the ball, that's when you get up off your seat or you get a wee bit expectant. And unless there's an end product, a great ball across the box or a finish, if they give it away or don't do anything great, that kind of disappointment kicks in. So I think if, Kuhn set such a high standard at the start of the campaign, I'm hopeful that it's not that he said it's been turned. I'm hopeful that it's just a dip in form for a young winger, which can happen, and that he picks it back up. And he's got half a dozen games to pick it up this season and then beyond.
There's been a lot of talk about the 3 big signings this season with Brendan: Trusty, Engels and Ida. And at the moment, 2 of them are in the starting 11. Trusty's dropped out, Scales has come in and done really well, but there's a big focus at the moment on Arnie Engels. So I know it's different, but during the week we used this as a scenario, right? We said, imagine Engels came through your youth academy, was introduced into the team this season as a 20-year-old. This was his first Champions League campaign. He's won Man of the Match awards in the Champions League. He scored 10 goals, 12 assists. He's been capped for Belgium. We'd all be raving about him, Asim. But for some reason, people are criticising him.
It's a price tag, isn't it? He's came
Absolutely.
in, record transfer fee in Scotland, well, not in Scotland, for Celtic, and the fact that on the back of Matt O'Reilly leaving, so people automatically seen him as a O'Reilly replacement when they're very different players, very, very different players. I think he's had a good season. I wouldn't say I think he's had moments where he's been really good, and then he had a dip in form like a lot of the team have. So I'm not concerned with Engels. I think there was quotes I heard from the weekend as well. I think he talks really well. I think he's very mature for someone his age. And again, came from a club where there was no expectation. For Augsburg, it would have been survival or mid-table. It's a big change. It's a big change in mentality. And I think that's where we've got that nucleus of guys that have been there and won it. Your McGregors, Carter Vickers, Alistair Johnson even now. But then they've been sprinkled around with a few others who maybe didn't have that demands. And I think that's where we probably struggled at points, where it's just getting that mentality right across the full squad. And I've got no issues with Engels. I think he can add a bit more in terms of goals from open play maybe, but he's got good numbers in terms of penalty kicks as well. And I think you'll continue to see him improve. So I've got no issues with there. And I think the fact that he stayed in the team, even though Bernardo's been back, again, I think that says a lot for the way the manager rates him.
I think it's a great way to look at it. If Engels was Daniel Kelly, if Daniel Kelly had stayed, started this season, so he's now on 10 goals for the season, big performances in some Champions League games and man of the matches, aplenty. But you're right, Quinny, he came from Augsburg where Brendan highlighted you play 1 game a week and that's it. Play your game, relax, do your rest and recovery, bit of training, another game next weekend. He's gone through that relentless period there that we had from, say, October to January, February. I think the weekend was Celtic's 51st game of the season. This is all new to him, but it'll stand him in good stead for next season, and I think he'll just kick on and get better.
And it's been called up as well.
Yeah, huge for him.
In every international window,
he's got one this season, so
except for the last one.
4 caps, I think, this season. It's been a huge season for him. I mean, I always remember this is, I think, the first name drop of the show, guys, right? But I was talking to Paddy McCourt. They need to have a sound effect for that, Quinny. I was talking to Paddy McCourt, and I remember around the time we turned the loan deal for Edward into permanent for 9 million. And, a lot of people are saying, is he worth 9 million? He's from an academy and all the rest of it. Paddy says, I always look at a player and say, right, could you sell him for the price you pay for him? And if the answer is yes, he's worth the money. And when I look at Engels, if you were to sell him this transfer window, you'd at least get your money back. You'd make a profit because he's actually developed and progressed since he came to Celtic. So I've got no concerns about it. I think we need to normalise big money signings because in order for us to progress now, and that's what we're going to get on to talk about, we're going to have to buy more kind of players like Engels, Quinny.
Yeah, I totally agree with that because, the transfer fees, and we'll come on to the rest of the transfers, I suppose, as well. But they are sensationalised, when it is the transfer window. And it's how much have you spent and who's the big money signing and all the rest of it. But the reality is, if Augsburg wanted to sell him for £1 million, we would have bought him for £1 million, and then it doesn't change who he is. He doesn't get shorter, he doesn't get slower or anything like that. So it is very abstract, and it's all about really, what you're getting for your money. And that kind of example of could you sell him for the same value, I think it's a good way of thinking about it, as well as if he was a Daniel Kelly type. I like that kind of way of thinking.
We were talking similar stuff, talking about Adam Ida yesterday on our show, and it's, if you take the price tag away, and I know you can't really, the reality is that's what was paid, but if Celtic paid 1 million for Engels, you'd be saying, what a player this guy is. He is the same player, whether there's an 11 million tag in his head or a 1 million. And I think we as fans can get caught up in it. I think Celtic overpaid. But from a fan point of view, it doesn't really matter. It's not coming out of our pockets. You know, it is what it is. And at the end of the day, you've got a talented player in Engels, talented player in Ida, and we can debate Trusty and what impact he'll have, but they're good footballers.
In the quotes I heard as well, I think he was asked about the price tag and whether that bothered him or he paid attention. He goes, I don't really care. And I think that, you know, he's came from the Bundesliga where it's just normalised. Like, fees like that, it's not a big deal. He's a Belgian international. I think the Scottish media and in Scotland, even maybe us as fans,
No, it's a big deal for us.
you know, because it's just so rare that we've spent that much. I think maybe it plays more of a factor in Ida's head potentially. You know, I feel like he's more of a confidence player. I think Engels is very confident and very assured in himself. I think Ida maybe has that, you know, moments where he doubts himself, or, you know, he's a confidence player. And he's one where a lot of people again said maybe we've overpaid. But again, these are the kind of going rates, and you look at his contributions over the course of the 2 seasons, his numbers are good. He's still a young player. And I feel like there's still a lot to come from.
He worried himself sick last week. That's how stressed he was.
Didn't he quite? Well, I was going to say, I think that's really the crux of it, is the way Celtic handled the business in the summer, because Osberg kind of knew we were coming with a bank balance and a desperation of this is our target, and maybe didn't really have another guy to go for. It didn't feel like it anyway at the time, and they just held out until we bit. Same with Norwich, you know. So I think that's really for us anyway, Celtic fans, where maybe the extra examination comes from. And for those outside, they just see it as, well, Celtic fans aren't happy with the 13 million or the note, so let's just keep beating that stick, and let's just let them forget it, keep it under their nose, sort of thing. Whereas, like, if we'd done that business, like, O'Reilly's out the door, Engels is in, fees, who cares, it was done quickly. I think a lot of that perception doesn't even happen, and then subsequently this stick that keeps coming back out to hit them with doesn't happen.
And you understand as well, folks say, you know, why did we not just go and get Engels at the start of the window? It's not how it works. I think agents say, listen, Arna, there's a few clubs in for you, sit tight. Celtic's a good option, there might be better. That's the way of the world. Arna Engels wasn't brought up a Celtic fan, and I think they'll sit tight. But I do believe Celtic, and I don't know, maybe we'll never know the inner workings, but it feels like we've overpaid, doesn't it? And you'd like to think maybe under Paul Tisdale or otherwise we'll get a wee bit sharper at
The
making
importance is it isn't reined in now, though, because you mentioned it, like 6 million Trusty, 11 Engels, 9. It's a lot of money, and people will be like, oh, 2 of them aren't even playing.
and Jota for it.
Yeah, but if the results speak for itself. You know, qualified at the group stage in the Champions League for the first time in so long, a treble potentially. That doesn't mean just because these guys aren't playing every week. That's a strengthened squad, and that's now the calibre of players, and that's the market we should be in now. And that needs to be Brendan's message going into summer, that no, this isn't going to stop at that now. Like, if you want us to get past that next stage again in the Champions League, I need to go out and spend again.
For so long we were in this 2 to 3 million project player thing, and that became such a term, project players. And I think Brendan's dragged that 2 to 3 million up to 6 to 7 million and maybe beyond for guys like Engels, and it has to stay at that level.
Pushing the envelope constantly. You know, the other player that was mentioned, Adam Ida, you look at his season as well, and again, it's been kind of patchy, I would say. What's he got, 15 goals now? So potentially he could get 20, there or thereabouts. He's done well in the Champions League, I think. Got his first goal. Bearing in mind this is his first campaign. Scores a couple against Villa. Does really well for me against Atalanta, and also Young Boys for the goal. He was involved in the Bayern Munich goal as well. I think he's had a really good European campaign. Yet there is this wee bit that you touched on, Asim, like, you know, he scores for the Republic of Ireland, and I think he gives it a bit of that. He was asked about it. It's about his critics, so it's in his head. At the weekend, Quinny, I was really impressed with his performance. I felt he was dropping deep. He looked a different player.
Yeah, I'm a fan of Ida, you know, like, and again, I'd echo what Tino said. It's maybe a bit of an overpay. And again, if you go back to the summer and think about how Norwich kind of seen us coming with the loan, they didn't have a deal kind of lined up on it already. But after the Aston Villa goals, like, I kind of said it on, you know, Celtic here and anywhere else, but like, after those goals, the transfer fee doesn't mean anything to me anymore, because the number one thing you want with the striker is, and yeah, maybe this season it's not quite happened for him yet, but can he do it in the derby, and can he do it in Europe? And the Bratislava goal, like, he scored against Bratislava, great, right? But going down to Villa Park and putting a couple, like, at that point, you know you've got a guy that can score against those teams. Will he do it every game? Will he do it every time? That's obviously something that's yet to be seen, but he can, you know, and that's the first thing we need to get. We're mentioned it with the mentality of players. We need guys that can do it, and then it's all about putting the rest of the team together. So I'm certainly a fan. I think that a little bit of difficulty comes but with Brendan's style of play, because he has been spotty in and out of the team, and that's because, like, you know, when Kyogo was here fit and available, he was first name on the team sheet. Now that he's gone, it feels like Dyson has maybe kind of walked into that void where Ida had a little spell where he was the man for like 3 weeks or something before that kind of thing happened around. So I think he's a little bit a victim of his job in the squad, because his job probably isn't to be the guy that plays 80% of matches. It's probably 60 or something like that, you know, for if you examine the whole season sort of thing. But I'm a fan.
Yeah, the other thing I was going to say there, as a Celtic fan, going through periods of domination as we are right now, I always feel that there's a moment where if you just hold on to the star player and then you complement that with new guys coming in, that's when you progress. And we've never really been able to do it. I mean, you mentioned we had to move on Matt O'Reilly before we were prepared to spend £26 million on 3 players. This summer is an interesting one, because I'm looking and I don't think there's any obvious noises that Maeda, for example, is on his way. We've speculated a wee bit about Kuhn. I wouldn't like to lose Kuhn because we've seen what he can do. So if you go into this summer and you don't lose a big name, we've already lost one this season with Kyogo as well, and you don't lose a big name, but you then bring in another 3 or 4. We know that Tierney's coming in the door. This could be a moment that we've probably never taken as seriously, you know, the Champions League endeavours, Asim. Do we have it also as a football club? Does the board have that belief? Will we spend money rather than, you know, actually when you look at the net, we never really spent anything, you know?
It has to be. I think it's non-negotiable for the manager. I think, you know, we have to match this ambition that he's said from day one that he's got, is to take us to that next level in Europe, and we've seen how close we got. You know, I'm a minute away from taking Bayern Munich to extra time. We've shown we can compete at this level. Okay, some people might say it was a decentish draw we got, but you know, you look at the teams, Bayern, Dortmund, Atalanta, Villa, all got into the knockout stages, and we competed well in all of them, near enough. So yeah, I think we have to. In terms of big money sales, like you said, it doesn't seem like there's an obvious one. I think Rio Hatate, up until the last few weeks, we were all kind of, you know, accepting that he might be the one that goes, and almost, okay, it's the right time for all parties concerned. He's put in a couple of really good performances that make you suddenly think, if you can play like that, you can be the heartbeat of the team again. But I still think this is third, it'll be 4th season next. I wouldn't be against maybe reinvesting any money, and I don't know how much we'd be talking there, but just freshen it up. I think Rodgers said that as well after the St Johnstone game. You need to change things up sometimes. You need to keep that hunger within the squad, that players aren't getting complacent. And I think guys like Hatate, who have been maybe 3-4 years here now, they're the kind of players you need to find the right time to move them on, bring in fresh guys that are willing to go again, and treat the domestic games with that same importance. Because I think it's for guys like Hatate maybe that they feel like they've done Scottish football now. You know, and they've won 3-4 titles in a row. So yeah, I think we need to freshen it up. Kuhn, you're right. I would like to keep him if his head's in the game. And other than that, it's just about strengthening the other areas. And I think there are a few areas that still need strengthened.
There is an optimal time to sell any player. You know, and Rangers suffered for not selling guys like Morelos and Kane and whatever. And Celtic's trading model is brilliant. But
Quinny giggling away.
Laughing up the back. Projects offer some Real Madrids and all that, you know.
I know, 50 million.
That one's going to work out. But the Matt O'Reilly thing's a great example. Actually, are Celtic 1 year, maybe this summer, maybe next, going to keep that guy, keep that star man, and add those bits of quality? In my Celtic supporting life, I've always felt, you know, certainly in the last 20 odd years, we're only ever a couple or maybe 3 players away from being a really decent side, and you can't go toe-to-toe with Bayern in the way that we did without being decent at least. And I think if you make those key additions, Kieran Tierney be one of them, but can you push the envelope, to use that term? But I think Celtic is a club for a long time now, and I actually think it goes back to 1994 and Ferdy's taken over, you know, a real dire time. Celtic are so conservative, small c, as a club, and there's people that have been there through, you know, you can talk about Peter Lawwell and Michael Nicholson and the whole pathway there. There's people there that are cautious by nature. It's just who they are as personalities. And there's this reluctance to really just go for it, you know, take the handbrake off.
Especially from a position of strength. You know, the notorious one was after the Seville season.
Yeah.
Everyone said, what a team we've got. But it's an aging team, we need to bring in, and I think, who did we buy? Michael Gray the next year or something like that. Same when Lennon took us to the last 16. It just seems like we always just put the handbrake,
didn't we?
Yeah.
We go down the way instead of going up the way. And the hope is, you know, we're absolutely cash rich. It's all there. And I hope that the board and whoever makes the calls, Dermot, Desmond and otherwise, they've witnessed this campaign, they've watched what Brendan Rodgers can do with a bit of backing, and as you say, it's a net spend, but 26 million give or take. That's where he can get is when you go for it a bit. Let's go for it properly and see where we land.
See, using that as an example, Asim, that time where we beat Barcelona, everybody remembers that, and then Juventus knock us out, and we don't get to a knockout stage again in that tournament until this season, right? And you look at what we did with that team, Quinny, and I always say this, Gary Hooper leaves, Victor Wanyama, Kelvin Wilson, these teams are dismantled. Joe Ledley is ushered out.
Sad.
Miku, that was the hardest one to take, aye. But Joe
Don't
Ledley,
forget he started that game against
so
Barcelona.
did Ambrose, by the way. F.A. Ambrose. Remember, Bruni was out that night.
He had a lot of players out. Hooper, Rooney.
Yeah. Aye. And I wonder if you can name the full 11. Have a wee think about that, the entire starting 11. But Quinny, my point is we dismantled that team. We've done it before. And we're at this stage now where we are strong. We're not taking anything for granted. We've still got Aberdeen to overcome in the cup final to win a treble. But after that European campaign we've just seen, let's not make the same mistake again. Do you expect us to do it differently this time?
I do, and I think like on a few different levels, like, we're all mad football fans and seen tons of stuff happen development-wise over the last 10 years, transfer fees, sports science and all the rest of it. And it feels like, for me anyway, that O'Neill team and the Strachan team, they were in a similar way to how Celtic runs it now, where it feels like the manager's the boss. They call all the shots, they make the decisions and all the rest of it. And both those sides were very win now foucused, and you can even look at guys like Hesselinks and Gravesons and Yarisics and these kind of guys that are brought in and they play straight away, and there's no fought on after 3 years when their career's done, what happens to them and that sort of thing. And it felt like the sins of the O'Neill era kind of bled into the next kind of couple, and again Strachan, we had a wee bit of penance to pay on some of those guys. But what I think, like, the net spend for Celtic is, was just kind of brought up there for the last 5 or 6 years has been zero. Really, we've not actually net spent anything, which is great. But one thing that has developed over the last 2 or 3 years, and I think in lieu of not losing a big guy this year, we might try and lean on again, is selling those project players. Like Bernabe was the highlight of it. In the last transfer window, a guy you didn't use, you got a few bob for. There's still a couple of guys like that roaming around, maybe not quite to the same extent that Bernabe's there. But with the reformat of the Champions League, like, I don't accept the whole lucky draw stuff, right? Because, like, if you look at this format that is there now over 5 different campaigns, you're probably going to get a fixture strength like that half the time, give or take. But the number one difference in this format that it feels like the protractors or the kind of naysayers are failing to recognise with it is, in the old format, we would be pot 4 or pot 3. So that means you don't play anyone else. It's pot 4 or pot 3. You're only playing the rest, as it were. Whereas with this format, we're going to play 2 pot 4s and 2 pot 3s every time, And as we've seen with the standards of the table, it's going to be people from the same countries. It's going to be the same champions from Czechoslovakia and Switzerland and, all these places again anyway. So there's always going to be 4 matches. We're going to be interested in the draw. Sometimes it will be tougher or easier, don't get me wrong. But there's always going to be 4 matches that Celtic should be looking at. Like, there's 12 points to be gotten. And then where are the other 4 matches? And, like, who's home, who's away? And how can we deal with that? So I've got a lot of faith that, and from the progress we've seen this summer, the board, Brendan, Tisdale, all the decision makers that are involved in the club do see that, not even with pushing the boat out further, but just copy and paste, just do again. Let's get 3 more guys in that we know can contribute to the first team. And again, similar to what we're saying with so many of these guys, they're not going to play 100% of matches across the season. And I know we want the project player to kind of go extinct, as it were. We don't want to be buying guys for 2 or 3 million for the most part, but clubs like us, in terms of stature and ambition from a smaller league, and there's plenty of examples we all kind of cite to compare with Celtic, Benfica's and Ajax's and whatever, they've got huge transfer turnover. They've got guys that they buy, they loan out, they loan in, they do all sorts of stuff. And if they don't sell a guy to Man United for 80 million, they've probably sold 12 other guys for 3 million around the place, and that funds them to go into South America and pull a wonder kid out of Brazil or something like that.
I've always felt there's a place for the project player, but alongside the more established player, or the higher calibre. It's going to be a huge summer for Paul Tisdale, I think, and whether Brendan stays beyond next season or not remains to be seen, but I do think we need to find a consistency, whether it's a director of football or I think Tisdale's head of scouting and recruitment or whatever the title is. We need someone to remain in the building to carry through that strategy, because all managers, Martin O'Neill's a great example, he built such a good team, but for the here and now. And you can understand why. His job isn't to make sure we're successful in 5 years. It's right now. And if you're not successful now, you're out. So you can see why there's maybe a short-term approach for some managers, But I think it's a case of Celtic trying to find that blend. And Tisdale or someone of that nature might help with that, but massive summer for
There
them.
was a reason both O'Neill's and Strachan's teams kind of fell off a cliff very quickly. You know, that after the 3-4 seasons, you know, they suffered in Europe. I think out in the knockouts in both Strachan's final year and in O'Neill's, because there wasn't that future planning. You know, he kept going with the same players, the same group, and didn't have that kind of foresight. But I think what you mentioned about the Champions League obviously is a different challenge now in the summer. Is for the first time in 4 years we're going to have to qualify again, and that's not going to be easy. So the recruitment needs to
What
be.
the coefficient points were on the board? I thought that was already sorted.
The lads have done us a turn again. Thanks, guys.
Well, I think that will help us down the line, but for next season we still have to have that one qualifier. So that's going to be a challenge in itself. But I think the Champions League format's been a breath of fresh air. This extended format, I think that's been the highlight of the season for a lot of us, you know, is the fact that's extended right up until February, and we've had that European football to look forward to. And you talked about other kind of teams that we can model ourselves. Look at Bodo Glimt, a team that we played 4 years ago, and we've seen then they were a really good outfit. Same manager, I think they've still got. And now he's got them into a semi-final of Europa League, and they've gradually just got better and better. And again, they probably work in that same model you mentioned, Quinny, selling lots of their kind of players, a couple of big ones, and just reinvesting and using that to become a kind of household European team. You know, they're constantly in the knockout stages, whether it's Europa Conference. Obviously, our aim is now the Champions League. But you're right, the way the format works, I think you give yourself a good shout to get past that group stage each season if you're wise, if you're clever in your recruitment. And that's going to be the challenge.
You know, using Bodo Glimt as an example, I was mentioning that, you know, other teams in Scotland should be looking at that as an example. I think it's 8,000 their capacity. So why not an Aberdeen, a Hibs or Hearts or Dundee United look at that and say, where's the stability with these teams? They change managers so often. I think in the last 5 years, Hibs have signed 50 players in the last 5 years. There's no strategy there, Quinny. It's just like chucking money and hoping that something sticks. Whereas that's a great example. If I was the CEO of a football club, I'd be engaging with that football team and finding out, what are you doing? Because we're no challenge to them over here in Scotland. And I used the example, Tommy Burns used to do it with Ajax. He used to go over to the Netherlands. He would look at the youth development and everything else. He was obsessed with trying to replicate it. And I think a lot of the Scottish clubs who, over the last 40 hours, have been bored with Celtic success, go out and learn. Go out and learn from a similar sized club and see if you can maybe implement some of these concepts yourself.
There's a few things with that, but kind of, I'll say on Bodo, like one of the great things that they did in the summer there is they actually brought back a lot of the guys that they've sold for big money. So this guy, JPH, he gets called for short. He came back from Germany, didn't really make it in Germany, but a really talented player. He's went back there. Patrick Berg, who we were linked to, I'm sure is back there now. So, you know, like you mentioned Aberdeen, like they sold Calvin Ramsey at Liverpool, but Calvin Ramsey's back on loan at Kilmarnock. You know, like there's some things like that where, you know, like you should keep your hooks into the guys that have got the fabric with you, you know, and we'll dig in deep in that sense. The second thing I'll kind of say on that as well is like in Holland and Spain and a lot of these European countries, they don't have that territorial thing that we have in Scotland where it's like mine's is mine and yours is yours. Like there's a very much more a community aspect to it where clubs feed players up the chain. You know, like PSV, and like Arjen Robbins and all these guys, they don't start at PSV, they start at Groningen, and Groningen say, here PSV, we've got Arjen Robben, give us a couple of million and we'll send him down the road to you. And it's like, it's the best thing for him, it's the best thing for us, and that's not happening in Scotland, period, you know.
A couple of points on that, just obviously, like you said, there's that self-preservation that, you know, you look at St Johnstone, the game against us a few weeks ago, gave us the 3 stands. I think I read somewhere the amount of money they made from that, equivalent to, I don't know, I can't remember what the exact figures were, but a lot of money that they made because they chose to give us. Instead, what we're seeing in most grounds now is empty stadiums. Who is that benefiting? Because it's not like these clubs can then sell it out to their own fans, because they don't. You look at Hearts or St Mirren or other teams that have done that and taken away the away allocations. It just makes for a really poor spectacle, you know. And these are the games that you used to look forward to, Tynecastle and Pittodrie with the big away allocations. Every single decision-making process that we see from these other clubs or Scottish football just makes it a worse, you know, product, and that's what's baffling. But just one other point was about the Aberdeen on the face of it when they got Jimmy Tillene from Elfsborg. I think he did a really good job with them. So I thought that was quite a good, you know, innovative kind of move from them, and obviously the way it started. So I've still got hope for them, and that's why I was enjoying watching what they were doing. Obviously, they fell off a cliff and have kind of picked up again. But yeah, that's what they should be doing. Look at these kind of Scandinavian sides and seeing what they're doing well and trying to emulate it here, because Aberdeen are a bigger club than a lot of these Scandinavian clubs that have managed to do well.
I think it comes down to who you benchmark against, and I think what seems to be healthy from the season that we're in is that Celtic now have set our sights a bit higher. You know, there's limited domestic challenge, you know, tedious treble, all that. So let's go and target, you know, whether it's Ajax or Portos or PSVs or whoever, and try and emulate what those sides are doing. But by the same token, Aberdeen, Hearts and Hibs, you'd maybe follow a Bodo Glimt and see what they're doing. And, you know, I tip it, you know, shared knowledge, best practice, all those things. But as you say about, you know, Stadia here in Scotland, it is self-sabotage at best. I don't understand how these boards who are accountable to shareholders say, yeah, we've left X hundred grand on the table here just because, you know, we're trying to be a wee bit difficult. And then you go the other way and Dundee United are charging £42 for this week, and that's another argument altogether. But, you know, several of us were at Hampden at the weekend, large pockets, large sections empty. Celtic could sell out Hampden 4 or 5 times over, right? There's huge demand for tickets. Yeah, I think the capacity or the attendance on the day was announced towards the end of the game, 43,000 for a 50,000 stadium. There must be a better way of doing things, and Scottish football continues to shoot itself in the foot.
Eat itself.
Every game that's on Sky Sports, like we all talk about the terrible TV package, should be a sellout and could be a sellout that they show, but a lot of the time it's not. And that's a starting point. If you want to get a better TV deal, because the likes of Belgium, Holland, other countries, I think even likes of Poland, I've read somewhere, have a lot more lucrative TV packages. Scotland could be doing so much more, and it's a real frustration. I think one of the kind of talking points has been on the shows the last few weeks is, do Celtic need to look elsewhere? Like, do we need to set our sights elsewhere? Have we outgrown Scottish football? And as much as for me, I still want to see Scottish football flourish and Celtic to be a part of that, but it needs buy-in from everyone.
Yeah. You know, on that point, Asim, right? Celtic have now won, if they win the treble, that's a caveat, 22 out of 27. The likelihood, the probability is slim anywhere in the world. Yeah, and the examples I use, well, Bayern Munich won 11 leagues in a row, but did they win 11 trebles? Did they win 6 or 7 trebles? No, they didn't. Juventus won 9 Serie A's, I think, recently. But how many trebles did they win? And it's so unlikely to happen that, you're right, Celtic, have they completed Scottish football? That's the question. Do you think the board look at it like that? How are they going to safeguard it, Quinny? And what's their ambition?
Yeah, that's the kind of the worry, isn't it? Is like, where is their scope? What is their yardstick on where the team can go? I think, like, really you have to take hope or solace from the campaign we had in Europe this year, that they see that success at that level now isn't that far away. Whereas the old format, like, you know, I used to say it quite often, but you could spend 200 million at Celtic, and if the draw went against you, it wouldn't matter. You know, like, if you still get PSG, Barca, and whoever quality pot 3 team was lying about that year, it wouldn't have mattered. You know, in this format, really levels the playing field in that regard, and we've seen it not just with ourselves, but with other teams that punched above their weight or did a bit better than forecasted at the initial part. So it's maybe a bit of a worry because they are conservative with a small c, and that's a strength, I think, for the club overall, like for the long term, and I think we're feeling the benefits of that. But I've always tried to hold on for all the criticism that Peter Lawwell's had over like however long. I've always held on to a little bit of, he is trying to play the long game, because he's always been involved in these like European boards and committees, and make no mistake about it, he has played a hand in this remodelling that we are now enjoying, you know. So I kind of go back to that, and I think, well, we're kind of now in the situation that we've hopefully been crossing our fingers happens and preparing for. And I'm hoping 13 million on Engels, 11 on this thing, you know, is just, right, we're here now, so we can do it now. Because the money we've pulled in this year it's probably close to a record, I would think, you know, without knowing the numbers off the top of my head or being that financially minded.
You know, when at the beginning of every season, when I go into it as a fan, I look at what my aspirations are as a Celtic supporter. Win the league. You win the league because you want to build on that, and you want your access to the Champions League. And I always say at least one cup. Now, am I being entitled? I don't know. I want at least one cup. If you win all 3 domestically, that's a phenomenal season. What do you think the board's ambition is?
I think for them, for so long, it seemed like it was just being better than Rangers. And I think that was a lot of the frustrations that we as fans had.
Keeping them at arm's length.
Yeah, as long as we win the league, and what was it all we used to say about Champions League? We account for maybe 1 in every 2 or something, 3 in every...
Celtic budget for being a Europa League team, that's fact. The Champions League's a huge bonus.
Yeah, and I think that needs to change now. Now it should be that we basically plan and aim to be in the Champions League every year, and it should be trying to get out of those group stages. And you mentioned before about the difference, and you could spend 200 million, you might still not get out of a group. a lot of people before this Bayern Munich tie said, doesn't matter whether we sell Kyogo, who we bring in, it's not going to make a difference. I'd argue that a couple more signings, if we had a bit more strength in that bench, we could have put them out, because it was at that stage where we were looking to bring people on. Brendan didn't make any changes because we didn't have the strength on the bench. So it just shows you how fine the margins can be. Now, obviously, that was a one-off tie, and people can say what they like, but I do feel that that's the difference now. And you're right, I think a bit more ambition, clever recruitment, and I think the ambition should be from the board is being a regular knockout team in the Champions League. That should be now the aim. In terms of domestically, yeah, obviously carry on as we are. We're not, you say entitled, I think obviously given the level of opposition. Look, I want a stronger Scottish football. I want Aberdeen, Hearts all to be stronger. When they're playing in the Europa League, Conference League, I'm always wanting them to do well. Again, with Rangers, you look at the Martin O'Neill team, what made that such an enjoyable period was we were beating a pretty good Rangers side.
Yeah.
Right now it's not the case, so it's difficult to gauge just how strong this Celtic team is, other than European success.
You've hit the nail on the head for me, Asim, and if you consider that it's taken 12 years to get to that knockout stage, and maybe in the past it's all about being just that wee step ahead of Rangers, that can come up to haunt you. That you could come a cropper with that, and it has happened over the last few seasons, whereby we've lost a league and we've not won a trophy. And yeah, I know there was other circumstances, but if you're not aiming for European success, then you can falter domestically. 1 in 12, that really isn't good enough for a club like Celtic. As much as we loved it this season, it isn't good enough, and it needs to be a season-on-season aspiration for the board.
Yeah, and Celtic get grief, rightly so, for not having progressed in Europe, over those last 12 years, which was why it was such a breath of fresh air. It was great to see, but it shouldn't be the anomaly that it seems to be at the moment. It should become semi-normal, maybe 3 and 5. Bruges are a great example. I think they're a team who have steadily just improved in terms of they've always been Champions League for the last 5 seasons, I think it is. But in season 1, they were just there and they didn't compete and they finished bottom. Season 2, they're a bit more competitive. Season 3, they get out the groups and so on, to the point they're actually a really decent European side. We are absolutely bigger than Bruges. I dare say our bank accounts are bigger than Bruges at this moment in time. So I mentioned, who do you benchmark against? Well, maybe there's a good example. Should Celtic pick up the phone and speak to whoever's in charge there and share some knowledge and best practice and do a couple of exchanges and maybe try and see, okay, you've done it more than once. What's the formula? And, how can we work together on those kind of things? Because the ambition does have to be far higher. I hope we've not outgrown Scottish football. I'm the same as you, Asim. I've got a passion for Scottish football in general. I want to see Aberdeen. I was almost cheering Aberdeen on in the first half of the campaign. It was refreshing to see a challenge from elsewhere. I'm delighted Hibs were brave enough to stick with David Gray and they're getting the rewards there. And you want it to be competitive, and you're absolutely right. When it was a competitive Rangers side and you were pipping them to the title, it was great. It was there to be enjoyed, and I welcome any investment in Rangers to an extent. I want a competitive Rangers, and that it raises our standards. If everyone's getting better, Rangers, Hearts, Hibs, Aberdeen, if they're all getting better, we will continue to get better. That's just nature as well, and it's up to Celtic to then respond to any challenge like that, whilst also trying to continue to improve in Europe.
Great. When you're looking at investment in Scottish football, my biggest concern is every time they've had money, they've never used it properly. So the investment is the top line, but what's the outcome at the end? Have they improved? Have they improved their youth development? Have they improved the football department? Because the business they've done in recent times has been absolutely shambolic.
The famous story was Kevin Kyle went in to negotiate his contract. I think his agent went, right, listen, $4,000, no less. They goes in and sit down. I think it was Alan McCoist and others are like that. Right, Kevin, we're giving you 8, but no more. And he's sitting with his 8. And I think they kind of played a bit of chess or whatever, and he ended up getting 9, something like that. It's out there on the podcast. They were just throwing money at guys like him and Ian Black and all sorts of stuff. And that was a genuine opportunity for Rangers to restructure their youth and cut their cloth accordingly as they work their way through the leagues. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time here on Rangers, but whether it's them or other clubs, 50 players for Hibs, that's chaos. There's no strategy there. But if they got investment and spent it wisely, there is scope to go and emulate a Bodo Glimt or somebody like that who's got similar budgets.
You mentioned Bruges there. I found it interesting when we signed Engels about his career path, whereby he starts off at Bruges, but they play him in the second team. So they're playing in the second tier of Belgian football, and that's where he gets his game time, which attracts Augsburg to come and buy him for about 200 or 300 grand. I think Celtic are hamstrung by a lot of things in Scottish football, that being one of them. It's one of my biggest bugbears when I look at the tradition of Celtic players that have come through our academies, and I'm now looking at the setup of Scotland and Scottish football and thinking it's virtually impossible now. Even when we get a talented one, you mentioned a few of them earlier, we can't introduce them, we can't give them enough game time. I felt that the move to bring them a B team into the pyramid was a good move, but it's not worked out because they've left them languishing at the same. Even if they were to win that league, they wouldn't get promoted. Bruges' second stringer called, is it Next, Bruges Next, and it produces players like Arnie Engels, who we then spend £11 million on. So there's things within Scottish football that are holding us back, and I think, you know, having a passion for the game and all that, you know, I do as well, but I just feel as though Welsh were there, we'll never achieve what we want to achieve.
Yeah, I agree with that. I can't argue at all. But I think kids need to get games. Lennon Miller's a great example. He's probably approaching 100 games now at senior football, and I hope Celtic do get him, but that's a separate story. But guys like Daniel Kelly and Dane Murray's and Rocco Vatas and Daniel Cummins, who wants to go and play Lowland League? I say that's with every respect to the clubs at that level, but that is their level. And these kids are elite talents. At 14, 15, 16, they were deemed potentially the best in Scotland, and that's why they end up at Celtic's academy. Do they want to go and play civil service strollers or Albion Rovers or all these clubs? Or do they want to go and get some proper senior minutes under their belt? And you can see why kids get frustrated at Celtic. And I wish I had the solution. I wish I had something here to offer constructively, but I'm not sure what the solution is.
Miller's a good example, just because you said it. If he's at a Groningen or something, he's definitely going to Ajax or PSV or Feyenoord.
Guaranteed.
Whereas you're looking right now, and you can't even blame him, but he's probably looking at Italy. You know, Serie A is his net. And as you said, like, we've all got a passion for Scottish football. We want it to be better. We've spoke about it on the show this season. You want your Hibs, Aberdeen, Dundee United, Hearts, so you're kind of strong traditional Scottish sides. I think most of them are in the top six, which is good, because you want them to give it a good go next season in European campaigns. But there's so many things that hold the game back, whether it's pitches, referees allowing certain type, you know, the challenges that they let go. There's so many things that hinder the game, that hinder youth football, you know, the youth talents as well. There's so many different issues within the game that you just wish they would come together collectively and try and make the game a better product. But
I think that's one of the things, like, as well, I'm very much in the same mind as you guys. Like, when whoever qualifies for Europa League and Conference League, I'm always cheering them on to get through the qualifiers and into the group stages and all that kind of thing. And it's so disappointing sometimes, the teams that knocks them out. But if you go back through the years, like, some of these clubs are really missing a huge trick. Like, I remember great Dundee United sides that were always covered in kids coming through the ranks. If it wasn't Johnny Russell, it was David Goodwillie. If it wasn't him, it was Andy Robertson or Gary Mackay-Stephen and all the rest of it. The Hibs team with Brown and Thompson and all these are, you know, and that, you know, that's not really Lennon Miller's the only kind of one now. Or there's a guy like Calvin Ramsey. There's one guy here and there that comes through. There's not really that kind of bleed through. So it feels like, you know, you mentioned, Paul John, the clubs don't do well with investment. I think a lot of them really get caught deer in the headlights. Like, do we try and win the new? Do we try and improve infrastructure? Do we hire it? And a big part of that, I think, is the footballing strategy. You know, like, what is the team about? What's the club about? How do we get our edge? How do we gain our success? Similar to, like, the Dutch example we've kind of all touched on a few times now, where it's like you live in your zone, you live in your space, and you maximise what you've got. And all these clubs throughout my lifetime have shown, like, I've seen Kilmarnock in Europe, I've seen St Mirren in Europe, I've seen Dundee United in Europe.
great.
Yeah, you know what I mean? Like, they can all get to the door, but none of them are kind of pushing to walk through it. And, you know, again, it's maybe not, I'm not totally qualified to speak on, like, every club and what they've done right and wrong and all the rest of it. But when I look across the league now, you're kind of looking like, do they have a Majowski in their team? Do they have somebody like that? Have they brought in, like, Thielen at Aberdeen? I think is a good appointment. I think the St Johnstone guys have a similar cut from the same cloth in a way. But there's not, like the Dundee United team that came through, those guys we mentioned there, their youth coach at the time was Ian Caffro. He brought all those guys through Golds and all the rest of it. Yeah. And with Hibs, I know Donald Park, who's associated with SFA, played a big part in that as well. So, and again, when you look across Europe, I remember, it's probably not true anymore, but maybe about 5 or 6 years ago, Benfica hadn't hired a youth coach in 20 years. Everyone at their club had worked there for 20 years or so. I mean, I might not be remembering it totally correctly, but that is like a uniform idea. That's processes, that's standards, that's everything. That's not like, oh, we've hired this guy. You know, it's like in work, you know, when you've got attrition, you lose good staff and you get other staff in, people move on and all the rest of it. You do lose identity, you do lose something along the way. And I think that's what a lot of the clubs, and I don't exclude Celtic from that, because what I think part of the frustration you've mentioned there, Tino, In the summer, they appointed Darren O'Day from B team manager to pathway manager. And maybe it's too soon to see anything from O'Day like the now, because these things take time to bleed through. But I hope that's maybe the beginning of, along with the facilities are getting built and everything as well, that maybe now we fast forward 4 years from now and we get a Lennon Miller or two kind of popping in, and do you know what, these guys on the bench can make a difference now, or they are the Engels, that kind of example we had a moment ago.
I know some parents who've got kids in youth academies, and some of the chat I've heard from guys, it's just anecdotal, but that they've taken their kid to a Motherwell or a St Mirren because there's a genuine pathway. If you get to 17 and you're good enough and you're knocking the door, you'll get minutes in the first team. Whereas some of these lads at Celtic, Daniel Kelly and Rocco Vata have been the more recent examples. I think they're about 19 or 20 now, and they've barely got senior appearances to call upon. Certainly at Celtic, Rocco Vata's playing a bit at Watford now. And young guys just want to play football and should play football. I think it's actually a travesty that during those formative years, 18, 19, 20, they're languishing or they're kicking the heels on the bench. You're not to learn anything there. Training and coaching and good quality coaching is great for them, but your real acid test is getting minutes on a park. And as I say, I don't have the solution, because what does Celtic do? Every game's an issue. Celtic lose to St Johnstone 2 weeks ago. It doesn't really matter, but we all lost our minds, right? We all lose our minds, even though it doesn't matter. So if you throw in, I don't know, say Dane Murray played that game and Daniel Cummins and we get beat, get these kids back out. You can't win at Celtic to a huge extent. And I don't know the solution. Phil John, you know from your time doing the Quality Street Gang, but guys like Danny McGrain and Paul McStays and all these kids coming through, they played reserve football against seasoned professionals. And what a grounding that was. They'd play against guys who are maybe coming back from injury or having maybe been at the tail end of their career, but real good grounding, real good experience. And that stood them in brilliant stead to be the pros that they became. The young players coming through at Celtic now don't have that avenue or that outlet. And as I say, I don't know the solution to it.
I like the reserve thing. I think the reserve thing's a wee bit of a thing of the past now, to be honest with you. I'm not harping back for the reserve league to come back, because as much as like it was great at that time and I see the benefits for it, but I think in the current age of football, the sort of thing that we've done with Wacker or Admira Wacker, and like Ben Summers, when he got his debut under Ange, he looked clever to me. Like, he looked really good. And you know, and I know on ACSOM a few days ago we were chatting about the Anderson boy a bit more as well, but Ben Summers he's getting, I think he's had an injury or two. But that's the sort of thing I think where we need to really like throw players out into, like, because we want them to play Champions League, you know, so they need to be used to playing European teams and going to funny stadiums and, you know, that kind of thing. So yeah, we would probably get something back we've lost with the reserve thing, but I don't think it's a real foot forward. I think it's more just a problem solver.
I agree, and I'm not harping back for that, but what I would love to see is these young players being tested at better levels. But Admira Wacker's a great example. Can we get more strategic about our partnerships? They seem to be a good grounding for Ben Summers and Matthew Anderson. Is there maybe some championship clubs in England that might help certain other players? Maybe some clubs in the Netherlands, something like that, so that they're testing themselves week on week against real quality, and then they can maybe come back a more grounded and more rounded player for Celtic.
I totally agree. I think it's partnerships. As much as I love harking back to the reserve, again, the reserve league doesn't exist because of Scottish football, not because of Celtic. You know, the teams didn't want to ring fence the money to run a team in the reserve league, and it was pulled. So again, that's hamstrung by Scottish football and other teams. Get the partnerships right, Quinny, you're spot on, and have half a dozen of them all over Europe, maybe, you know, and have these players out. It's great to have links to certain managers. I know that Bruni's taken on a young guy at Celtic, at Ayr United from Celtic. I know that Dunfermline have done it in the past as well to good effect with some of our youngsters. So have some domestic, but also, as you say, get them used to travelling and playing in different countries, different cultures. And by the time they're 19 or 20, they come back and they're a completely different monster than someone who's been playing in the Lowland League.
And maybe that's what Dan O'Day's objective is, I don't know, but maybe that's part of his role, to get these guys the best possible education, whether it's a couple of years playing for the 20s, a year in, you know, a foreign country, you know, develop as a young person as well as a player, and then come back with half a chance of making it.
Yeah.
Even when we talk about the recent chat about the league reconstruction, just the fact that they wanted to make it smaller rather than bigger.
I know.
You make it bigger, you've got more teams playing with a bit more freedom, a bit more ability to bring in youngsters. You can then loan it out to these kind of clubs that are playing against a similar level. There's just so many things that can be done better. Like, for me, I think it would be such a fresh, you know, breath of fresh air to make it like 16, 18 teams. You know, you mentioned Ayr, Dunfermline, Falkirk. These kind of teams are no worse than your Ross Counties or, you know, clubs like that. So I think that would have been a great chance as well to look at
variety in it as well.
You know, and I don't
Let
think
them breathe. It lets the clubs breathe. It allows them to introduce young players.
play with more freedom rather than say this win at all cost mentality that a lot of these teams seem to play with.
Final thing I'm going to ask you guys, right? 9 in a row is always in your mind, isn't it? As soon as you win your first, it's like, right, how many more? So this season, we should wrap up the 4th in a row. In 5 years' time, this is a proper strategy question. Where are you going to be in 5 years' time? It's going to be 20, 30, 31, Quinny. Scary, isn't it? 20, 30, 31. If we're successful, we'll have won 9 in a row. Where do you see Celtic in 5 years?
I would like to think in a lot of the places that we've all kind of hoped and we've mentioned in the show today, you know, like 3, 4 out of 5 Champions League campaigns, getting out that group and regularly spending 10 million quid on a player every summer or so. And do you know, it is a funny, because it is like it's kind of like the holy grail, isn't it, for us at this point? Have we completed Scottish football? Probably not in that sense, because there's, you know, the one after 9 to maybe go on it thereafter. But like, I'm quite hopeful that the Champions League reformat we've seen this year, and kind of the hire the Tisdale, we've just mentioned O'Day's kind of change of role, and there's a few other bits and bobs around the club where we're seeing some evolution, is probably the best way I would put it. So I would sincerely hope and love it if we were, not just within ourselves, but in the wider footballing community, much more easily accepted as being in that Ajax, Benfica, Porto kind of category of an elite team that's not in a Big 5 league. And it's not just us kind of saying, we are that, by the way, you know, like, it's actually like, it's just undeniable, you know.
Yeah, and again, it is, you're right, until you win the 10, we've not completed Scottish football, have you?
How do you say, I know it sounds counterintuitive, I don't want Celtic to win 10 in a row. 10 in a row would mean that there's no competition, and it would mean that Celtic have just, competition is healthy in my opinion. Now, I'm not saying I want a strong Rangers, no, don't throw that back at me, but I do want a strong Scottish football, and I want Celtic to have to work for their titles. Now, if we work for them and get 10, brilliant, but I don't want us to coast to a 10 in a row, because I think it leads to a dropping of standards. I actually think let's call it the failed 10 in a row, during the COVID season, it really hampered Celtic. I thought we started to, rather than as a club look 5 years ahead, we started to think really short term. We don't want to rock the boat because we're near like the 10. And actually, it was trying to get the 10 that led to a real collapse of that side. You can debate who tried or not, but Odson Edward didn't want to be there. Chris Ayer didn't want to be there. Ryan Christie didn't want to be there. And what we can see is that when players don't want to be there, you need to let them go. I know there's contracts and things in place, but you need to work out a way to move these guys on, and you need to have hungry and motivated players. And I think that should have been a lesson to Celtic, that you can't think in that way, and you need to look at bigger picture. So yes, I hope we win the 10, but you can see my thinking.
I can see where you're coming from with that. It seemed like a little kind of short-term thinking at the time, which was just, let's just get the 10. As you say, keeping players that potentially didn't want to be there. The board just thinking again, that usual, the fans will be happy. We've got one over Rangers, you know. I think this time it's got to be different. As much, obviously I want to see the 10, but for me, where do I want to see us in 5 years? What's the guy's name? Stephen, that's been on the show before.
Stephen Craig.
Yeah, Stephen Craig. A Lisbon in a lifetime, he always calls it, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Now, it's difficult now because the way it works is there's no drop-off into the Europa League. So let's be honest, we probably aren't going to see Celtic in a Champions League final anytime soon. And it would require them not qualifying for us to be in that Europa League. But you've seen it this season, and you've seen Celtic progressing in Europe. If it gets to that stage, I'd love to see Celtic get to a European semi-final or a final, and I think that's doable. We've seen it with Rangers, when what they've done in the last few years in the Europa League. A quarter-final this year, a final a few years ago. I think domestic dominance is brilliant. Never take it for granted, of course, but where you're truly measured in terms, and I think that's what's good about Celtic and about the fan base, is we're never just going to accept it. Just like, we're going to love it, we're going to appreciate it, we're going to enjoy it, but ultimately you want to keep progressing, you want to get better, you want to see further improvements. And for me, that now our ambition and our vision should be, how can we get to a European final, semi-final?
You understand that from this entire 1 hour conversation, someone is going to clip Tino saying, I don't want to get 10.
They're going to mug me off.
That's going to be the headline.
Get me cancelled.
I would love to win 10 in a row, but not coast. And what I mean by that last time we won 9, you look at some of these seasons where we're playing Carlton Cole and Colin Kazim Richards, and we were coasting a bit, you know? So you want the standards to be top level. If you lose, and you can't say that's because the recruitment wasn't right, or that's because we don't do youth development right, or we should have, when we had all that money, reinvested it into the stand. If you've done all these things and you still lose, that's because you've been beaten by a better team. So, I get what you're saying.
Yeah.
I want to win 20 in a row. Of course, we all do, right? But you want to do that at the absolute peak of your powers, don't you? Because if you do that, then you've got a much better chance of, getting what you aspire to be, which is a proper European club, isn't it? That was an hour. It could go on a lot longer. Will we do it again?
Absolutely. Yeah,
Absolutely, yeah. I really enjoyed that. Thanks for joining us, lads.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Bring the pies next time. Thanks again for joining us on A Celtic State of Mind. Be sure to come back at 6 o'clock next Friday for This Is ACSOM.